Thank you for joining us today. This is going to be a session on advancement, particularly for assistant and associate professors whose primary focus is research. We'll have a presentation for a portion of the time and then have some time for questions. Several of the appointments and promotions committee have joined the call. And I will be explaining what you can do if you have questions during the session. Christina, would you like to explain that to people? And just so you know, I'm hoping we'll have a chance to introduce some of the key people. Christina Ignatius is in the HR unit of the department, and she helps to coordinate things working with the central HR section. And I see that Lisa Partridge from the central HR section is also with us, and she'll be available to answer the difficult questions. Christina, do you want to explain to people what they can do if they have questions?
Yes, absolutely. And just to reiterate what Dr. Nelson had mentioned, this particular session is geared towards assistant and associate rank faculty in the Senate and Adjunct series. There will be a second presentation specifically geared for HS Clin faculty on June 25th. And so if that's more appropriate for you to attend, those meeting details will be disseminated the week of June 22nd. So before Dr. Nelson starts his presentation, I'd just like to clarify how we will be handling questions today. Let's see here. If you wish to remain anonymous, you may submit your question using the chat feature, and then I'll present it to him to address during the session. If you would like to pose it directly to him, you can go ahead and unmute yourselves. Dr. Nelson will provide several opportunities throughout the session where you may present those questions to him. So thank you again for attending, and now let's turn our attention to Dr. Nelson.
Okay. Now, let's see if I can get the, here we go. First, I'd like to, if you don't know who's on the committee, these are the committee members of the Appointments and Promotions Committee. While this committee does a lot of work, it's a nice committee for me to be on and to chair, because we have a very responsible and active group. Everybody participates. Everybody comes to all the meetings. It's just a nice committee to be on. That's my perspective. For the rest of you, the important thing to know is that not only do the committee take this work seriously, and we understand these issues are serious to the faculty, people are responsible, and we do our utmost to try to be fair to people. I think fairness is perhaps the most important thing that we strive for, because without that, then the system falls apart. We try to be fair, and this presentation today is part of our effort to also be reasonably transparent, not about individual discussions, but about the process we use to consider people for advancement. So let's keep going. Another thing I'd like to just remind you about, I have the feeling that when we get to the point, or from your perspective, when you're thinking about your own advancement and you're a little concerned about the committee reviewing your packet, it's natural that there's a kind of us versus them or me versus the committee kind of feeling. If you take a larger view, it's important to remember that it's in the interests of the department for young faculty to be successful. So we all want people to succeed. And I say that because just from a practical perspective, that's what kind of drives us all, that we want junior faculty to succeed. I thought I'd try to anticipate a couple of questions so that you didn't have to sit on the edge of your chair. One of them, and I think this question has already been asked, if not once, a couple of times in one of the town halls. How will COVID affect my advancement? First of all, remember, we're all in the same boat. In other words, I think you know what I mean. Everybody is suffering, if you will, in the shelter in place currently, and so all of the faculty are up against this. Second, our A&P committee, the dean's office, and CAP, the committee that ultimately reviews promotions and other advancements, we're all very aware of the situation. In a more detailed way, if you think about this, much of the work this year that will be evaluated has been done prior to the shelter in place. And let me just give you a couple of examples. Important papers that you'd like to include in your packet. The work for that will likely have been done last year. It's likely you will have submitted the paper last year, or at least before March of this year, in order to have it published or in press at this point. And the same thing holds for grants. It's likely that you would have submitted grants prior to March 16th when the shelter in place began. It is conceivable there may be some things that were right on the cusp that may have been more affected. Next year, I think COVID will have or may have more of an effect than this year. And I say that because the longer this goes on, it will just have more of an effect. Next year, what the committee will be evaluating will include this period of time that we're now experiencing. And in fact, at this point, we don't really know what the full effect of the COVID situation will be for the rest of this year. But again, we're all in this together. The other thing that's come up, and I've had some questions about, and I've talked with some people, but not most of you, there have been some questions about how to handle maternity leave when you're preparing your CV. For people who are actually in the ladder rank or the in-residence series, you do have the official mechanism of requesting a stop the clock procedure, which means that for a period of time when you're out on leave, that time is not counted towards the 8-year rule. The 8-year rule for those particular series is that within 8 years you need to be promoted to associate professor. That involves a relatively small number of people. We have many people who are in the adjunct series, And for that group, the 8-year rule does not apply, but it still leaves the question of, well, what should I say about maternity leave? I asked the dean's office because I thought it was important to see what the official word was from them. And they said that maternity leave, they view it as invisible in the advancement process. And in other words, that is not, shouldn't influence advancement one way or the other. However, for various things like this, if you want to say something about maternity leave and how it influenced your research, you could include a statement in the narrative section of your CV having to do with research. I've been told, and I didn't anticipate this, so I'm glad I was told, that some people were worried that if they did say something about maternity leave, it might have a negative impact on the committee, that we would think they're less competitive, that they valued having children more than their career or something like that. And I'm hesitant to speak for people that may have, I don't know the various things people might think. There's no harm in saying something about maternity leave. On the other hand, you don't need to say anything about maternity leave. Again, our committee is very aware that people take maternity leave. 4 of the 6 members of our committee are women, if that makes a difference. So I think it's up to the individual. I don't think, and usually whether you include this in your CV or not, most of the time someone on the committee is aware that the individual has been out on maternity leave. That doesn't, by the way, actually change the criteria for advancement, but we still like to know the circumstances that people are working in. So we usually know that in any case. So let's talk a little bit about some of the differences in the series. And this is a complex chart. This is in the faculty handbook. And if you've not seen the faculty handbook, you ought to read through it. It's quite helpful in terms of understanding advancement and differences in the series. For our purposes, I thought I would kind of zero in on the series that with a research focus shown here, and highlight some of the details. And the main differences, first of all, the ladder rank series and the in-residence series are quite similar in terms of that each of these various sections, teaching and mentoring, research, professional competence, university and public service, are all considered essential in those series. In the adjunct series, a different statement is made. Research is still considered essential for most people, but let's just expand on this issue. The adjunct series requires excellence in at least one and preferably more than one of the following categories: research and creative work, teaching and mentoring, university and public service, and professional competence. That's the statement from the handbook. And it said that exceptional achievement in one area may compensate for less activity in another area. That seldom comes up, and I actually wouldn't count on that statement. I think for most people in the adjunct series, and this is just a crude estimate, like 98% means excellence in research. And one of the things the handbook doesn't really describe is that there is either an explicit or implicit agreement between you and the chair or vice chair about what your focus is. And for most people, their focus is research. And if that's the focus, then when we go to review someone's packet, we're focusing primarily on research. It is possible that with agreement of your vice chair and or the chair, that you would agree that teaching was going to be the primary focus. And in that case, the committee would put more emphasis on the focus of teaching. But at some level, there has to be an agreement about this. It's not the case that if you are in what everybody else thinks is a research series and with a research focus, you would not be able to, on your own, decide that university and public service was going to be your primary focus. You're going to be judged on the basis of your research. This is the other statements in the handbook with respect to associate professor and professor. I just want to highlight the statement that if research is a criterion, you must attain national recognition for independent contributions in research. Independence in research includes publication as first author in peer-reviewed journals, independent extramural research funding, and principal investigator status. That's for associate professor. Professor, the main difference is that international prominence related to research should be demonstrated. This is what the chair letter looks like, showing that teaching and mentoring are evaluated, research and creative activity are evaluated, professional competence and university and public service are evaluated. I think most people are familiar with teaching and mentoring activity. We want to know that people are doing some teaching and mentoring. Again, this would be a section where adjunct faculty would differ from in-residence faculty. In-residence faculty would be expected to do a fair amount of teaching. For adjunct faculty, not so much. And this would go on to include development of new courses. We look, of course, at ratings from mentees or from the standardized course ratings, and look at peer comments. Research and creative activity for the group of people that who joined us today. This is the area that will receive the most scrutiny. And again, this is directly from the chair level. We evaluate things like productivity, independence, significance of research, collaborative research, peer-reviewed research support, and then give an overall rating. And we'll look at things like number of grants, status of grants. For example, are you the PI, a co-PI, or a co-investigator? A type of grant, is this a foundation grant or an NIH grant? We look at peer-reviewed papers, and in particular, we'd look at first or senior authorship. We'd look at the impact of the journal. We also will focus a bit more on the last cycle. And remember, that means the last, for those of you who are assistant or associate professors, the last 2 years. For everybody, and especially merit advances, the last cycle gets kind of an increased level of scrutiny. And then in this section, we'd also include comments from extramural reviewers. Now, I'm going to go on and just discuss each of these a little bit more. First, productivity. The handbook spells out that And hopefully most of you can see the full slide. Peer-reviewed publications are the main criteria by which your research productivity will be evaluated. First, authorship usually signifies the lead role in the conduct of the research reported, and that person has the primary responsibility for writing the manuscript. Senior authorship or last authorship usually reflects the overall guidance of the research reported, as well as careful and frequent review of the manuscript. Hence, first or senior authorship helps to document your research independence, which is the second bullet in this list. Significance of the research, things that would bear on this would be things like, is this an NIH grant versus a foundation grant? NIH grants will usually receive a greater scrutiny, and of course, that the peer-reviewed scrutiny that a grant receives is also an indication of the quality of the grant. Collaborative research is not a requirement, but these days it's extremely common, usually viewed as a positive thing. And last is peer-reviewed research support. We wanted to say a little more about the distinction we make between the role of grants in academic advancement and funding the individual's salary. And it's important for you to have kind of an understanding of the difference there. The individual's vice chair will address salary funding issues with the candidate. From an academic perspective, grants reflect the process of supporting research to gather data and the hypotheses that lead to publication of original findings. So our committee is not so worried about the bottom line of whether you're supporting your salary or not. You need to discuss that with your vice chair. What we're concerned about is the individual getting grants, which will allow them to do original research and lead to publications based on those research findings. As I mentioned before, peer-reviewed grants at NIH reflect the quality and originality of the work. And PI status reflects independence and leadership. These days, we're seeing a lot of people be a co-PI, a multi-PI, a site PI. All of those things are good. I think we still will make a distinction and would like to see that the individual has a status of PI on some of the grants. Let me say while we're at it, because if I don't say this, I'm sure there would be a question about it, or there should be. NIH grants are not the only prestigious form of grants. There are VA grants, Department of Defense grants that are also quite competitive and are viewed as, well, in a similar category to NIH grants. Research leadership, there's not a particular line to comment on that on the chair letter, but the committee does consider the issue of research leadership, and this is kind of an overall assessment of productivity, particularly as a first or senior author. that you're establishing recognition as an authority, that you're on a particular topic area, that you're mentoring and fostering the development of postdocs and other young investigators. So we'll sometimes say that an individual has excelled with respect to their research leadership. At the associate professor level, we're looking for evidence that the candidate demonstrates research leadership, and we will be successful as an independent investigator. Why don't I stop there for a moment, and I guess I can, actually that's a good question. I'm not sure I can look at the chat box. Are there any questions at this point, particularly about how we evaluate research?
Hi, this is Tiffany Ho. I have a question.
Sure.
I'm an assistant adjunct professor. My question was, how important is it that faculty in my position who are early career and who are adjunct, how important is it that we demonstrate independence from former mentors, and does it matter if those mentors are at UCSF or outside of UCSF? So for instance, we may have mentors who are very enthusiastic about our research and want to be involved in all of our grants and our papers. How does the committee evaluate grants where we are PI or lead author, but a mentor or former mentor is a co-I or a co-author?
That's an excellent question, and other members of the committee may also have some thoughts about it. Just a couple of things that come to my mind. We did have an individual who listed their mentor as the senior author on many of their papers, and just about all of their papers in which the individual up for review was listed as the first author. And it made it kind of harder to evaluate that person's independence. We realized that it didn't altogether negate their independence, but it did, it wasn't so clear how independent this individual was. So, and this is also an issue for the senior faculty and for the mentors. I did have a discussion about this with one of our senior people who was actually hadn't thought of it from this perspective, and was quite open to the idea that probably shouldn't be listed as the senior author all of the time. So that does come up. The other, I was trying to think of the other example that had occurred to me. When we review outside letters, UCSF is one of the few of the top flight universities that does not require arm's length letters. And arm's length letters refer to letters by other well-known people in the field who have not been the primary mentor of the individual. The individual in question did not start out in that person's lab. It's not someone, arm's length reviewers are not someone with whom the person is currently working on research grants. So an arm's length reviewer is someone who's somewhat independent. We would certainly take the comments of an arm's length reviewer quite seriously. And if you have people, it's okay for you to say, be on a symposium with someone so that that person knows you a bit, but they're not closely involved with your work. Having an extramural reviewer who we can view as an arm's length reviewer, I think is helpful. I'm not sure everybody agrees with that. I know there are some people in the dean's office who don't think that distinction is so important, but some people do think it's important. So those are two ways in which that might be an issue. Any other members of the committee have a thought about that?
I'd like to make a comment about the question of a former mentor becoming a senior author in a paper, because we also want to acknowledge the importance of ongoing professional relationships and the fact that sometimes the student becomes the expert in a particular area of the research and the previous mentor becomes a collaborator who is given authorship as a result of their contribution, but it doesn't mean that they are leading the research. So I think some of us find that an important issue to consider, that for many emerging faculty members, the ongoing relationships that they have is part of their collaborative spirit and their team spirit in conducting the research, and they want to maintain the relationship with a mentor, and that doesn't mean that they're not the ones that have academic independence. It's almost like now the mentor is learning from them, and I think that that is a dynamic that I would like to represent here as well.
I really appreciate these responses. So to be more concrete, if I or an assistant adjunct faculty member were senior author on a paper and a former mentor were a co-author but not first author, would that be evaluated positively and demonstrate a sign of independence?
Alicia, do you want to respond?
I would tend to evaluate it positively. And I think, if I may say so, this is where the conversations within the group, within our committee, become very interesting, because there are always points and counterpoints, and it becomes a very dynamic conversation.
Yeah. I mean, if I can add something to that, this is Lisa Fortuna. I did come from a university where the arm's length was necessary. You could not have a letter from anyone you've ever published with, like even if it was like 10 years ago or something like that. And it became challenging for me in the sense of, like, I was able to have people who were arm's length, but I had a very strong network and relationship with people who were in the Latino mental health services research
That's right.
world, which is not a finite world, right? Like, there's specific big players who I grew up with, right? And who now saw me as a colleague and could recognize my contribution, independent contribution to that field, and could speak very strongly to it because they're in that field. But I couldn't include them because once upon a time I published a paper with them, right? And or they were part of a scientific group that, that I was a junior at that point. So I think you have to sort of look at what the field is too, and who can really speak to this person's emergence as an independent investigator and leader in the field. And sometimes that arm's length closes up that field of people who can speak to that.
Lisa, and I can speak also from the point of view of the field of infant mental health, for example, which is also a very specialized field where people really form communities that are very tightly connected. So I think that it's a mirror image of the description that you are giving. And I think that context in which the research is happening needs to be taken into account in making this determination. So thank you for giving that example.
And if I can add something. Go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to bring up just one other point, and I'm curious what the committee. This is Marina Tulusham. Sorry. One thing is about the senior authorship role of junior faculty. I just want to point out that, understanding what the senior authorship role and how that's defined as well, too, is really important, I think. And I have seen multiple instances where junior faculty are agreeing to be senior author on things that are because there's advocacy issues with being first or second in some ways that I've seen around manuscripts. And I think it is important. And I'm wondering if Craig and others on the committee could speak to the senior authorship role for those who are more junior and maybe how that's perceived when, is my question making sense? I've just observed this happen before. And so
I think for several of the comments, it is important, and Alicia kind of alluded to this, that when you get down to, Tiffany had mentioned a concrete example, and even if you try to be very specific and very concrete, you have to look at these things in a slightly broader context. We usually will have an idea whether the person really, and I think this addresses Marina's question or comment, usually we'll have a sense of whether the person is really in a position to be a senior author, in the sense that they are running the lab and that the area of expertise is within their area, and so that they can really be considered a senior author. In general, if someone is just starting out and is in the first step or two steps of being an assistant professor, we wouldn't really expect much in the way of senior authorship. And this becomes much more important when the individual becomes a more senior associate professor or full professor, when the person may not have many first author publications, but may have a lot of senior author publications. And it's pretty clear that the person is the senior author. So that there's senior authorship and senior authorship with a small s, which is essentially being listed last. Or, it's not uncommon to see two authors listed and someone is last. So, we do try to consider whether someone really is a senior author or not. And
this is Nancy.
With respect to Lisa's comment, that we realize that the issue of whether someone is an extramural reviewer or not may have a fuzzy boundary, that there's you do want someone who knows who you are. It is, and I think the example that's often used is, it's okay to have been on a symposium with someone. If you ruled all those things out, it would become almost impossible to find someone who could serve as an extramural reviewer. So we realize this is fuzzy. UCSF in some ways makes this easier in that you don't have to be an arm's length reviewer. On the other hand, to the extent that it looks like this person is likely to be a little more objective, that's a good thing. Are there any other questions from our junior faculty? Why don't we move on, and we can come back to any of these issues. Professional competence.
Can I add something?
Yes. Go ahead.
I think these areas that are fuzzy, people should feel free to include a letter to the committee that explains what the circumstance is. So if it turns out, for example, you have a mentor with whom you've published a great deal, it would be helpful to have a statement about how your work has become independent and what you independently bring to this collaboration, even though there are a number of publications together. So, I think because we do struggle as a committee when we hit someone where all the letters seem to have been from their former institution, and you don't know if they're doing something independently of the people they were working with, since their graduate school days. So if, to have a statement, and I think it's also important for team science, where you may be a middle author on a lot of very important papers, and it's hard for the committee to know what role did you play in that, but you have an opportunity to clarify that. So I would really encourage, in these areas where you're struggling to say, how do I, will they understand what I actually did, is to include that in your packet.
That's extremely helpful. Thank you all for your insightful responses.
This is Dan Mathlon. I'd like to just make a comment about something that I know in my world of clinical and neuroimaging research, again, over the course of the last 20 years, in a number of clinical domains, there have been efforts that have been encouraged by the NIH to move toward team science and multi-site collaborative efforts, much more so than maybe 30 years ago, where people were much more focused on the individual R01s. And in the early days of encouraging investigators to forego applying for individual R01s and to join multi-site team efforts, concerns were raised about how their local universities would evaluate their independence and their promotions. And there was along the way discussions about universities also starting to change some of their thinking around these things, because you can't do everything, and if you do, there's an opportunity cost to joining a multi-site effort, and in some cases, this is very much encouraged by NIH. The other part of team science is that as things have become much more technical, let's say in neuroimaging, that it's very common to have teams of investigators with different expertise who come together, and it's a little bit hard to designate one person as the overall intellectual senior person. And I haven't heard anything in this discussion so far that seems to acknowledge that trend in science, and especially junior faculty are going to be asked to participate in these kinds of efforts. And I think we need to give a clear message one way or another about whether this is unwise or whether this is there is some movement in how this is thought about.
It's a good point, Dan. I think I did mention that we certainly are seeing more and more that individuals are listing themselves as a co-PI, a site PI, a multi-PI. I think it's the narrative section of research can be used to help explain what the individual's contribution is. It's still the case that this issue of research leadership is important, and certainly being a co-PI, a multi-PI, a site PI is a better example of research leadership than being a co-investigator. It actually hasn't been a big issue for us. If anyone else on the committee can remember an instance without discussing individuals, if someone has had several major grants and they're a co-PI or a multi-PI, that we've given that a lot of credit. it is a challenge, I think, though, for someone at the assistant professor level to demonstrate, or challenge is the wrong word. We are looking for evidence that the individual is developing independence. So it makes it easier if the person is just a PI on something, even if they have a co-PI, but if they're who's also listed on the grant. If they're the PI, it makes it a little bit easier to evaluate that person. Anyone on the committee have another thought or comment?
This is Carmen Masson. I'm not on your committee, but I would say that if it's an NIH grant and you are a multi-PI, you're being evaluated by peers that you're bringing something unique or your expertise to a grant. So being a multi-PI on an NIH grant is significant and shouldn't raise concerns about whether the person is independent.
That's a good point.
I think it goes back to the topic of being part of a collaborative project versus dependence or independence. And I think that that is something that we take very seriously.
Yeah, this is Janice. I want to echo that too. And we are very well aware of, because many of us are or have been on study section. And so we really look at MPI also very seriously in terms of the type of grant and the type of roles, but definitely encouraging everyone, just like what Nancy pointed out earlier, is to provide us with additional information, whether it is part of your research program description, or if you're at the point where you will be requesting letters, such as for your promotion. That will be very important to mention those as evidence of your independence as well. So just for your reference.
Why don't I just have a couple more slides, finish that up, and then we'll take any questions. This has been a helpful discussion. Professional competence. For this group, this section is a little bit more important. When I first came to UCSF and looked at this, it wasn't what I was expecting. And I think clinicians are often a little bit surprised by this, and sometimes have been concerned about a favorable rating if it had to do with their clinical competence. This section really addresses things that when recognition outside the department was important, and it still is for folks in the research area, this section addresses that. So it will comment on things like awards received, service to professional organizations, service to journals as a reviewer or editor, presentations at national and international meetings, serving on a study section, and we'd be noting extramural reviewer comments here as well. So this really has to do more with kind of developing recognition outside of the department. University and public service, it's again worth mentioning for people in the in-residence and ladder rank series. We expect a reasonable amount of university and public service for people in the adjunct series. There's less of an expectation. On the other hand, it's not a good idea to have no university service. That seldom happens, but we'd encourage everybody to get involved with some committee. And just as a way of explanation or definition, VA committees, SFGH committees are considered departmental committees. I think that's enough to say about that. So we have a few minutes left, and would be happy to take other questions.
Craig, while people are thinking about questions, let me add one other thing, because I think it may be clear to people what the process is if we talk about the role of CAP. Because we make our assessment, but we also keep in mind that it's going to be reviewed by CAP, and we want it to be successful at that level as well. So I don't know if you want to say anything about that.
Sure. Just in terms of the process, this goes to the committee, we review it, come up with our decision. It's reviewed by Matt next, and he certifies the chair letter. Then it goes to the dean's office. The dean's office reviews it, and they may come up with their view, and they're prepared to present their view at CAP. CAP is the final committee that in the process, and that's the Committee on Academic Personnel. I always thought it was Committee on Appointments and Promotions, but technically that's not what it means. We do kind of keep in mind what we think CAP is looking for. Although it is, again, in the service of transparency, each of us kind of keep each other honest. When we're reviewing someone, we realize that our decision and our kind of defense of our decision will go to the dean's office and will go to CAP. And if we have concluded something that's out of line, we anticipate that will be a concern, and so we try to avoid that. In the past 2 years, we've sent about 230 reviews. Actually, that's not the number that goes to CAP. We sent that number to the dean's office, and approximately 60 of these went to CAP. We've had 2 of our recommendations overturned by CAP or requesting additional information, which we provided, and then CAP agreed with us. So we've had a pretty good record of our decision being upheld, but the process does include review by the dean's office and CAP. And since we know that's going to occur, that keeps us honest that we have to be following the, what the guidelines say and what the dean's office and CAP are expecting.
Hi, Dr. Nelson. I have a question that came through the chat.
Mm-hmm.
And it is, I think I recall correctly that the department was going to provide an internal review for faculty 6 months before they're up for promotion. I am up for promotion, but did not get this review. Is this something to discuss with the committee or other department leadership? I
have the feeling that that it may be important whether this person is in the adjunct series or the in-residence series. But Lisa, are you still on the call?
Yes.
Lisa Partridge.
Lisa Partridge. Okay.
Oh, I'm glad you're on the call though too. Lisa Partridge. I'm not sure that this is called an appraisal, and people in the in-residence series are supposed to have an appraisal. I don't think that's required in the adjunct series. Can someone say whether that's their Andy, do you have
Craig, yeah, I wanted to talk about that. So we made a plan to implement this, and actually we had planned for it to be 2 years before people go up for associate. And I think a problem we've run into is that the system for triggering that has broken down, and it's fallen through the cracks lately. I think it may have happened in the transition from Marlene to Jane as associate chair for administration and finance, because Marlene was spearheading that. I apologize because I should have been my responsibility to make sure that happened, and I plan to look into this and make sure that that happens in the future.
Hey, I just wanted to just say quickly, I've been on for a few minutes. It's Matt, and I'm incredibly sorry that there was a scheduling snafu in my office. So as soon as I got off that call that I was on, didn't realize it was here. I'm here now, and I don't know whether that helps or hurts, but just wanted people to know that I'm on the call. And yeah, Andrew, thank you for that answer. I think it's really important, and whoever asked the question obviously should feel free to reach out directly to you. In order to make sure that this gets followed up. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and what we had hoped to do in that review was to identify a group of people to give a person a review and feedback and make a plan. And we instituted that on a number of occasions, and then in retrospect, I noticed it stopped happening at some point. So I'll look into that, and I apologize to everybody that we weren't on top of it.
And if I could jump in, this is Shelley Kennedy from HR Shared Services. I just want to jump in and just to confirm that the formal appraisal process are for Senate titles, so for in-residence, ladder rank, and clinical X, in which those at the assistant level are up for appraisals. And those in the adjunct and HS clinical who are non-Senate do not require an appraisal packet.
But we had committed to doing it because we thought it was a good thing to do for everybody. So
got it.
It was intended. It was not a requirement, but it was something that we had wanted to put in place as a valuable process.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
That would certainly be helpful. At the moment, we have more people in the adjunct series than we have in the in-residence series. Any other questions? Actually, it's 1 o'clock on the dot, so we'll have to stop shortly, but any last question?
Hi, sorry, this is Tiffany Ho here again. I had hopefully a quick question. Historically, how successful have faculty in the department been in switching between series? And are there any other aspects one should keep in mind beyond the specific criteria for evaluation for the series that they want to switch in when making that transition?
If someone is kind of meeting the criteria that we'd expect, people have been very successful in changing series. It is a little more complicated. For a change in series, it will usually require a search for the position, and the length of time to accomplish this takes a little while. Can require outside letters, does usually require a search, and then it comes back to the committee for approval. But most of the time, people who are thinking about doing a change in series have either spoken to their vice chair, which they ought to do as part of their regular review, or they've asked me and gotten some feedback about whether this appears a reasonable thing to do. And so with that,
Greg,
yeah, go ahead, Andy.
Can I say something about that? Yeah. This is something that I look for in the annual discussion I have with people generally. Sometimes we may neglect to have that conversation, but it is in the intent. And then we have the clinical and translational researcher committee that reviews these applications for our department for the clinical and translational researchers. For basic science researchers, it's a separate process. But and we review them. They look the same as a person who would be applying for a position from the outside. It's a significant process. And then that committee weighs in about whether there's a recommendation to make the transition in series, and we make a recommendation to Matt, and then things proceed from there. So we have the process in place, and it works as I just described. And if anyone has questions about this, please contact me. I'd be happy to talk with you about whether it's appropriate to make the change. One thing I will say is that the criteria for switching from adjunct to in-residence is something that we talked about as a group, that the primary criteria is evidence of independence. It's similar to the move to associate professor. Craig, do you want to comment on that?
And we want to see, remember, the in-residence faculty are expected to be doing more in terms of university service and teaching. So if the person already has some evidence of being involved, and most people in the adjunct series are involved in those things, it's a little trickier if someone wants to make that switch and has not been doing much teaching and has not been, had a couple of instances where the person was not involved much at all in university service, and it's just something that needs to be attended to. I think we're actually a little bit over time. This has been a useful discussion. I wasn't sure myself whether the Zoom format would lend itself to discussion, but we did well thanks to the participation of many of you. So thank you.
Thank you.
Please feel free to email any of us with questions if you had them that we didn't get a chance to address today because we ran out of time. But we'd be happy to answer them. I appreciate people participating today.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much.
Bye.
This was super helpful. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.